It depends on the live stream. Hold on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dean's Forum at St. John's Cathedral. I'm Richard Lawson, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us online. I'll say an opening prayer and then introduce our guest, David. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for this day, for this sunshine on a cold morning, and for this chance to gather and to think about what it means to be whole and well and thriving and flourishing in the presence of God. Bless our speaker, David, with wisdom, and open our minds and hearts. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So we're delighted to have this morning David Galvan with us. He is a member of St. Michael's Episcopal Church down in Colorado Springs, a great parish with a great rector and a great deacon, and a place that is thriving right now, and in part because of an emphasis in that parish that David brings on what it means to be healthy. What does health look like? Mental health and healthy leadership. David is a mental health professional. He's trained in mental health first aid. He's also a director of something called Soul Shop, which you'll tell us about in a minute. Our youth minister, Sarah Strand, has spent time with David and has been much, much impressed. So the genesis of the forum this morning and next week is really to get David here to be with all of us in this setting and to be with our youth, both middle school and high school, this afternoon from noon to 2 p.m. when he'll gather with them for lunch and for conversation. This is a two-part series, and unlike several of our series that we do here, it's not a Q&A between David and myself. We quickly realized David didn't need that. So David's going to do a 40-minute, give or take, presentation on his own, and then he's going to do Q&A with all of you. Tom Keys will come around with a microphone at the end, and I say that now, so hold your questions, think about your questions if you need to write them down. There's going to be plenty of time for Q&A at the conclusion of David's talk. This week is primarily focused on mental health in relation to faith, and next week is primarily focused on suicide in relationship to faith and mental health. So a two-part series, although there'll be some overlap that begins this week. Please join me in welcoming warmly David to the Dean's Forum. And here's your mic. You good? 8 weeks to see Dad. We'd fly out of DIA. Oh, that's the voice of the Lord there. We fly out of DIA, and we would actually have to drive up to Colorado Springs. Anybody ever been on an early morning flight before? Early morning flights? Yeah, it's because we're cheap. And so one thing I want us to realize is that I decided this particular time, my daughter was 10 years old, going back home and to her mom's, and I decided we're going to stay at a hotel with some friends at a sweet hotel, and instead of getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we did, and so she had to go to the restroom. She walked down the hall, like little hallway that we had there, and then all of a sudden I heard this voice, and she's like, Dad! Dad! And I'm like, what does she need? She's 10. So I get closer to the bathroom door, and before I could put my hand on the door, I hear it again, and she goes, Dad! Dad! I'm bleeding! And I was like, I'm thinking the same thing that you all are thinking, okay, because we went to health class, all right? So I'm going to open the door with this thing in mind, and I open the door, and she goes, Dad, look, I got a cut on my leg. And I was like, okay, good, all right? Why do I begin there this morning? I begin with this because if we're going to have this conversation on mental health, it's very similar to what I encountered there. Many of us, when we encounter individuals and they're asking for help or their cries for help come out, we think instantaneously we know what they're talking about.
I thought I knew what I was about to walk into. I could have come over there with all the resources that I could, pick a size, pick a thing, whatever it is, I don't know. And then you just pick that, do your thing. But here's what happened. I didn't. I just opened the door. And if we're going to have this conversation around mental health, all I'm going to ask you today to do is this. Let's open the door to this conversation. Is this something that we should be talking about? Is this something that we should be engaging conversation with? Where did it, and we're going to write some things up here, but is it really, is there, Bible representation of this in our ancient writings? And we're going to talk about that today through our process, and I'm going to give you some tools, and then you're going to ask some questions, because I'm not going to talk about everything today, but you're going to have questions. And I hope I leave you today asking more questions, because my goal as a facilitator, as a trainer, as a communicator, is to inquire and increase your curiosity. I love curiosity. I ask more why questions and wondering questions than anything. I'm that guy, because if you look and you watch Jesus' journey through the gospel, you watch his journey, do you know that he was asked over 300 questions? He was asked over 300 questions, and he only gave 3 direct responses ever. All the other times, he's that annoying guy that just keeps asking you the question. So what do you think? I don't know. That's why I asked you. So today, I hope I increase that curiosity in our conversation. So my topic today is mental health. Mental health and its relation to faith. And why is that important? We must begin first with what is mental health. Mental health is not the absence of mental illness. We often think about this. There's this idea that in our culture that we've actually equated mental health with this mental illness. I would say this, and I do this in a lot of the facilitations that I do, is I'll say mental health, and I ask what comes to mind first. And in your mind, you might have thought instantaneously mental health, and you went right to anxiety, depression. You might have went right to those things. But do you realize if I were to say physical health, you'd be like exercise, dieting, eating right. You wouldn't say cardiac arrest, cancer, gallbladder disease. You're like, oh, those are 2 different things. Mental well-being is not solely the absence of those things. Mental health actually rolls on a spectrum. And I'm going to do a lot of writing and drawing, because one time I decided I would be Bob Ross. And so I want you to notice here is that mental health lies on a spectrum. And it's going to be hard for us to see on the digital world, and my apologies. Next week we'll have slides. This week I just wanted to draw. And so mental health lies on a spectrum, and it goes from healthy all the way to unhealthy. Okay? And all of us in this room today lie somewhere inside there. We lie somewhere in the place of healthy and unhealthy of this. Just like with your physical health. Some of you lie in the healthy, and some of us are in the unhealthy side. It doesn't automatically mean if we're not healthy, it doesn't automatically mean we have a disorder or a disease or something wrong with us. It just means that we might not be well. Today, you could come in here today and be stressed. You could be thinking about a lot of other things rather than listening to whatever preaching was going on today. You could find yourself maybe in a challenge. You could find yourself in a challenge, not a crisis, but a challenge. You're like, I've not been well for the past couple days. And I'm grieving something. I lost a friend. Maybe I'm grieving something that happened this summer. Maybe I'm just grieving the fact that I don't like that it gets dark at 4 o'clock in the evening, okay? But what happens is mental health being on a spectrum lies and says, okay, what truly is mental health? What does that look like for us? And mental health is a few things. Number one, it's the idea that we can actually cope with everyday stressors. It's just the ability to work through those. Say, well, yeah. And it's the phrase that I grew up with. My parents would often say, my mom would be like, well, everybody's got problems. And I was like, oh, yeah, those are called everybody's got stressors. There are things that stress you out that don't stress other people out. Some of you don't care if you get to somewhere on time. Others of you be like, we have to be 5 minutes early or we're late. Okay? There are different stressors for us. Stressors and being able to cope with them is part of mental health. The other part of mental health is the ability to emotionally regulate. To emotionally regulate. What do our emotions say? What do they do for us? So we're going to talk about those ideas. But if we have the inability to emotionally regulate and the inability to regulate our thoughts, this is why the gospel tells us, actually, when you read in Scripture, it says to take captive every single one of your thoughts. It's to regulate your thoughts. Do you know how much, if you read, and I read often through the lens of mental health, and there are so many great tools within the Bible that are transferable into mental health if we just did them. Take captive every single one of your thoughts. Regulate your thoughts, your emotions. The other thing that it does is what mental health is. It's the ability to fruitfully and productively work and contribute to your communities. Mental health and mental well-being is the fact that you can get along. You have friends. You have family members. And that's great because you don't like all of them. I know. But yet the ability to have mental health or to have good mental health is the ability to say, I know how to relate, and I can relate even in the midst of disagreement. Now, today, I have my wife here with me, and she can confirm this, so you can ask her later, not during Q&A. But you can ask this question, like, we can disagree on things, but still be well. Agreeance does not mean that you're well. Sometimes you agree just so you don't have to have the disagreement, okay? And the husbands are like, yes. But here's what I will tell you. These three things that I just described, this idea to work productively and fruitfully and contribute to your community, emotional and thought regulation, and the mere fact that you are someone that says, I can cope with everyday stressors, is mental health. And that can be lying on a spectrum anywhere in here. If we can do that, first and foremost, we have to break those down then. What does it look like to do coping? And I'm going to talk about that as we get later in our conversation, but I want to discuss first and foremost emotions, because all of us love emotions. I say that sarcastically, and here's why. Because we have not been often taught how to navigate our emotions. Some of us don't even want to touch emotions, if we're really honest with it. If you want a great film for this, if you've not watched the movie Inside Out, please do so. Okay, just go watch it for yourself. You're never too old to watch cartoons, all right? Like, just watch them. Did you know that, speaking of cartoons, did you know that George Jetson would be 3 years old today? Like, literally, George Jetson, for those of us that know, the Jetsons, he'd be 3 years old according to their timeline. Like, that's how old we are. Okay, here we go. We're older than George. Okay, so what I want us to think about is emotions, and I'm going to bucket these emotions into 5 categories. The emotions are bucketed on this film in Inside Out into 5 what we call big bucket emotions. We have sadness, we have joy, we have disgust, we have anger, and we have fear. These 5 emotions are emotions that are indicated in this particular film. And they all have different ways of thinking of how this one individual should operate. The wholeness of these matters because there's one emotion in this entire film that's not allowed to touch any of the memories. For those of us that have seen the film, do you all remember what emotion that was? It's sadness. This emotion here was not allowed to touch any of the memories going on in this young person's life. It said joy was the protector. Joy was like, don't touch it, sadness. Don't touch it, sadness. Don't touch any of the memories. And if you watch the film, and I always find this curious, the most annoying emotion in that film is joy. Joy is that person like, it's the greatest day ever. Let's go do this. Awesome. Don't be sad because we're at church, okay? Joy in the morning. Like, we go through this process. And Joy was doing that through the entire film. But what you do and learn during this film is this one idea. Is that to truly understand what joy is, the fullness of joy, you must fully experience the fullness of sadness. When you don't experience the fullness of this emotion, you rehabilitate, you disregard the other emotions that are there. Because we've been taught, don't touch sadness. Don't touch it. You might have taught it like, have you ever taken a 2-liter soda bottle and shook it up? Yeah, some of you are like, please don't tell me about that. You took that 2-liter bottle, it shook up because it fell out of your grocery bags before they were 10 cents, and it fell out of your bag, and now all of a sudden you open that little soda bottle, and if you go to open it, it spills over on everything and makes a mess, doesn't it? And some of you like, when I ask students, I take that 20-ounce bottle that I shake at their school classroom, and I said, what's the best way to open it? And students will tell me, don't open it. And that's what we've been taught with our emotions. We have this world shaking us up. Your work shaking you up, your family shaking you up, and it creates all these emotions. And if you ever take that bottle after it's shooken up, you know how hard rock it is? And you wonder why you're jaded. You've been taught to just keep the cap on. Don't open it. Maybe like tink it on the side. Do the top. And we use these methodologies, but if we realize this, the best way to open that bottle, don't open it quickly, because some people are like, you've got to talk about your emotions. You've got to talk about them right now, right now, right now, right now. And those are the people that make the bigger mess. And then you got so much more to clean up. But if you were to just take it and go like this, guess what that is? One small conversation. Another small conversation. Till that person's fully open up and pliable now. If you really want to do this work and you really want to understand these emotions, you as yourself have to do it that way. Don't try to do all your emotions at once. Please don't. I just want to discover my emotions because David talked about them today. Please don't. Take the bottle cap and go, just do some at a time. Emotional regulation tells me what this emotion is. Now, why are these emotions important? These emotions are important to identify for us because emotions, and I'm going to do it this way, emotions are not, there's nothing about emotions that is telling us anything but this. Emotions are neutral. There are no good emotions and no bad emotions. There's just emotions. You're like, no, there's bad emotions. No, they're just maybe not comfortable to feel. I don't like to feel anger, but I get angry because I drive I-25. Okay? I don't like sadness, but it happens. I don't like the fact that I feel some of these emotions. And some of us in this room have been actually taught not to even enjoy the emotion of joy, happiness, elatedness, contentment. We've been taught, like, don't, because something's going to go wrong. Something like, you feel good right now, you're like, oh, well, I'm just waiting for the next thing to go wrong. And so we've been taught not to even to feel those emotions. And here's what you're going to hear from me. Emotions, when we talk about mental wellness, is regulating emotions, but it's also regulating our thoughts or how we think. So what does this mean for us today? Emotions are indicators of what people believe. This emotion here, whatever this emotion is, it tells me what you think. How do I know? Because I could do one thing to someone here, one thing to someone there, and one thing to someone there, and you all would have different emotional responses. Does that mean someone's wrong? No, it just means you think differently. I have two nephews, same parents, like all in the same, they're these fun-loving nephews, and I'll go to their house, and when I get there, one of my nephews will run up to me and wants to wrestle me and take me out. The other nephew is like, don't touch me, okay? Different expression because of what they believe. He's like, I don't want to wrestle you. I'll give you a hug, though. Okay? Why? Because of what they believe, but they had an emotion. The emotion is this indicator. The first thing that happens, though, is this thought process. That's why both of these must be regulated, because they create what we call actions or behaviors. So, if you have an emotion, you've been taught not to have an emotion, you truly don't know what you believe. People walk into counseling sessions all the time, and they're like, I'm overwhelmed. Okay, what does that mean? Because that's not a feeling. That's just telling me what you believe. What's the feeling that's going on there? Is it sadness? Are you overwhelmed because of joy? Are you overwhelmed because you're worried about something? Are you overwhelmed because you're grieving something? This emotion, if we're not going to tap into these, we'll never allow this to happen, and then our actions will show that. Now, those actions are there on purpose. There's actions that we know that happen because our emotions are trying to help us protect us. I grew up with some uncles that would, I'm Latino, and so I grew up with some uncles that would scare me. They talked about the cucuys, for those of us that are Latino, the ghost. And they would scare the junk out of me. I'm 3, 4, 5 years old. And they would sit around scaring me. And I told my wife, and she was very early on in our marriage, I was like, you can't be around a corner and go, boo. Like, don't do that. Like, please don't. She thought I was joking. And so she did. One day, she's around a corner, and she goes, boo. And I automatically went, boo. And I was like, I'm sorry, but I told you not to boo me. And the reason why I said that is because I knew what my reaction was going to be because of the emotion that I had, because of the thought process that began it all. these thought processes and these actions, some of you have these emotions, these actions that happen. What is it? The action that happens is you get sick to your stomach about something. Because studies and research show us that our body tells us more about our mental health well-being than anything else. You ever got sick over something? You ever got like so worried about something, like bowel movements could have happened. You got so worried about something, you just wanted to sleep. You got so overwhelmed by something, you just recluse. Because they tell us when mental wellness is not well, one of the first things that happens when our mental health starts to decline, isolation happens. I don't want anybody to see that I'm not well, so I'm just going to back up and go into the darkness. And if we look at these ideas in accordance with Scripture, you can actually take Psalms. Over 72 of the Psalms are written by David, and there's actually writings about this that you could have clinically diagnosed David with manic depressive disorder. Look at the Scriptures. Look at the Psalms, up and down. One moment, you're the best. The next moment, I just want to hide in a foxhole and never talk to anybody and see anybody ever again. Do you watch the emotion levels that happen in David's life. David's life, like we read these 72 Psalms that he wrote, and you see all of these emotions because of the thought process that he had, and he took actions because of it. A great psalm to read Psalm 51. You want to know what it's like to experience a panic attack? Read Psalm 51. Heart beating fast, chest is clenching. You can read all of these in Psalm 51. They're there. These things are not just happened. It's not because our times, in the ancient days, they didn't know the word mental health or mental illness. Some of these words we didn't even know in the 1980s or even in the 1900s. We would just call it insanity. We'd have insane asylums where we'd have to send people who acted differently than the typical behavior of a human being, and we would send them to these insane asylums. Some of our cultures stigmatize this phrase, and we'll talk about stigma here in a minute. They would call them loony bins, mental health wards, whatever you want to call a mental ward. And what happens is that during those times, if you read in the ancient writings, they use the word madness. And you can actually find this word over 33 times in the Bible, describing individuals with madness, which nowadays we have clinical terms for those. You could see our King Saul, a leader that was, just so you're clear, that was appointed by God because of the people, and he could have been clinically diagnosed with schizophrenia. But he was leading a country, and other country leaders said, that guy is insane and unable to be reasoned with. They would talk about these ideas because of the emotions that they saw and the actions that came from that, knowing that this individual was not well. He had what we would call a mental health disorder. What's a mental health disorder? A mental health disorder is when these things are disrupted. When you're unable to emotionally regulate. When you're unable to regulate your thoughts. Thoughts are taking you captive. When you're unable to regulate your actions. We have students that are in schools nowadays that we see high levels of conduct disorder. Like, why can't they just sit down? Why these typical behaviors sometimes are impacted. Now, how can these disorders begin, or what's going on, and why are we seeing them? It's because we're seeing them for many different reasons. Some of us instantaneously in this room might go, it's the cell phone. Maybe. But here's what I'll tell you. Every generation has some technology that we all blamed it on. Some of you all had it blamed on color TV, okay? My generation was blamed on MTV, okay? Other generations had something that they blamed it on, but the reality, it's really this, and I'll share this. It's disconnection in human beings. Technology, with its advancements, requires that we become more disconnected. Color TVs, you know what color TVs did? Put us all in front of a TV and not communicate. You know what DVDs did for us? Made us all have a movie night thinking that we were connecting, but did we have conversations? It created these things with technology, and social media did that, impacting our emotional state, impacting our thinking state. But what are other things that impacts this? This is a nature versus nurture conversation. Can you genetically acquire some of this stuff? 100%. There was a study done on mice. They actually took this father mouse, and every time it smelled cherry blossom, they would shock this father mouse. It smelled cherry blossom, shocked the father mouse. This father mouse had a litter of mice, and that litter of mice, every time they smelled cherry blossom, they would have the same reaction Dad did, but they were never shocked. Did you ever do, this is my thing. You ever did something that you're like, I'm becoming my mom? Yeah, okay. That right there is what we do, is what's called a modeling behavior. You saw your parents do something. You saw your guardians do something. The adults in your world respond to a situation a certain way, and guess what you did? You responded the same way. Because, like, that's just how mom did it. That's my favorite story that I've ever been told, illustration. There was this gentleman with his wife, and they were getting ready for a holiday dinner. And as they were getting ready for the holiday dinner, the wife had cut the ham in half and put it in a pan. And he goes, honey, why did you do that? And she goes, well, it's because my mom did it that way. And then he was like, so he goes to the mom and says, mother-in-law, hey, why did you cut the ham in half and put it in the pan? He goes, well, that's because my mom did it that way. So he goes to the grandmother-in-law and says, hey, how come you cut the ham in half and put it in the pan? And she goes, well, because I never had a pan big enough. And the reason why I share that with you all is because there are things inside of us, like genetically, neurochemically, and biochemically, that you are predisposed to whether you want to be or not. You're like, why am I more anxious? Why am I more predisposed to sadness or depression? Why am I more predisposed to anger? My mom grew up in a household where she was the one of 4 children that was taken with her mom when her mom and dad had split, divorced actually during that time when divorce wasn't as well aware as we are now. And she went with her mom, who was an alcoholic, a living alcoholic during that time, and had lived with substance use disorder, quite frankly, undiagnosed. And she lived through this process. And my mom was the only child that went along. As she went along in that process, she watched mom navigate the stressors of life. And what happens with those stressors of life, she would increase alcohol take because stresses would happen. And so my mom went in that process and very quickly found ways to do that same process and increased anxiety, didn't know where safety was going to come from, had new boyfriends coming in for mom. And then eventually mom was pregnant with twins, and then my mom had to take care of these 2 twins of her mom. And so she was at the teenage age at that time. And then I became the byproduct of a teen pregnancy, don't know my biological dad, and just saw this circular process happening. My mom was 28 years old and had 6 kids under the age of 10. Okay, some of you are like, I know, dude, my mom's a saint, y'all. Like, I'm pretty sure she's going to get a church someday. But here's what I know, okay? I know my mom in this situation, we would watch her growing up and be like, Mom's doing that thing again. 2 or 3 days. And then it would go away and then come back in a few weeks or so. And we just watched that coping mechanism. And I can tell you by fact, by watching a family of mine, 6 different people, watching our parents navigate crisis, and seeing how this was in our gene, like I would be more anxious. And then now I watch it in my daughter. And I'm like, oh, like I modeled that behavior. One day I came home and I saw my daughter doing this thing right here. And I'm like, what are you doing? And she goes, Dad, I'm thinking. I go, then why are you doing this? She goes, because every time you think, you do this. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I'm not modeling healthy coping mechanisms. I'm just modeling what the behaviors that I saw my parents do. When they get stressed, they reclused. When they get stressed, they were a little bit more instantaneously activated. You know what I'm talking about? You're like, you're a little bit more snippier. You're a lot more snippier. And they would get degrading, or they would just shut down. No connection. And many of us who've navigated this idea, these are called maladaptive coping skills, unhealthy coping mechanisms. They may help you to survive the current trial or tribulation or the thing that you're going through, but they might not be healthy for you long term. Does that make sense? So what we need to do is adjust this idea that mental health and these coping skills, we need them. And some of them are physical things like exercise and sleep and dieting. They've actually done studies where there's a nerve that goes from your brain to your gut. It's called the vagus nerve. And that vagus nerve tells us more about what's going on. Do you know that like what you eat impacts your mental health? Y'all know it, because when you're not doing well, you get that ice cream, you're like, all by myself, I'm so lost without you, right? You do this thing, or you have chocolate. Like, foods do something to us. That's why we have a category called comfort food, because it does something for our mental health. And what I want us to recognize is that when we increase our physical health, it could potentially increase our mental health. That becomes a coping mechanism. What is it that you do when you're angry? What does it do that when you're sad? What do you do when you're full of joy? What are your coping mechanisms then? There are certain things that you do with joy that you're like, that's probably not the smartest idea. You go spending a lot of money, and they're like, what did I just do? And we do that both ways, but what I want you to identify are what are your healthy coping mechanisms to continue to increase your mental health on that spectrum that we talked about, because when you hit a challenge, do you know what you do versus just reclusing, isolating, and actually putting yourself in more mental health unwellness? Because that mental health for us, when we look at it from a biblical standpoint, and I'm going to share this and then I'll take questions, as we look in the gospel, Luke 2:52, Luke, being a physician, writes this statement. He says, and Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, in favor with man, and favor with God. He grew in wisdom, our mental, emotional health, stature, our physical health, favor with man, our social health, and favor with God, our ethical, spiritual health. He grew in those 4 areas. Why do I bring that up? Because if he could grow, it also implies that he could not grow in those areas. But I find it curious that Luke wrote to us, he wrote this idea that Jesus grew in these 4 areas, and he didn't just write as a doctor, physical. He didn't just write, and Jesus grew. It's important for us to be aware of that, because for us to be holistic in our health, holistic, we must be willing to grow in those 4 areas. In wisdom, our mental and emotional health, our stature, our physical health, our social health, in favor with man, and favor with God, in our spiritual health. That is what creates full health wellness. It's not just one area. I have friends, I got a brother I'm pretty sure he's Incredible Hulk. He is like just physical. He's in the gym almost every day. Commander of some police in Castle Rock. Huge. Mental health, not so well. Just because one of your areas is good doesn't mean the other area is going to be. We must take care of these. Today's conversation around mental health is to say, okay, how do I regulate these emotions? How do I regulate my thoughts? How do I take those ideas and cope well through stressors so that I can increase my wellness, so that I can holistically live, not just live with one aspect. I hope today you learned something, caught something along the way. I'm going to take some questions here for the next part of that. Tom's going to help facilitate that. Tom, any comments before you get started, or do you any questions, or what are the logistics? Do we just want to go ahead and ask? All right, very good. Questions that you all may have as I wrap up our time today around mental health and this faith idea. Yes, there's one back here. We're going to get the mic to you because it's on the interwebs, so just give us 1 second to get to you there.
If I'm a baby, do I have emotions? Do I have thoughts?
Oh, yes,
it's
100.
It's logical to me that having listened to an NPR thing about people that were deaf, that didn't know any sign language, they could not talk about what their life was like before.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that emotions precede thinking?
Yeah, this is a great question. I love this. There's actually data and research that shows, especially for infancy, the most impactful time of our lives is actually 0 to 2. There is so much that we are absorbing around the world. There's so much that we're absorbing within all those informations, regardless of some of the physical differences that we may have or emotional differences. We are taking in all that information. There are things that you are being impacted by. They call these adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. There are things that we are being impacted by as infancy and 2 years old. You could do nothing about, but you were taking in information. This is why toddlers know what right and wrong, like healthy and unhealthy decisions are. You see them. They do it. They're like, I know I'm doing the wrong thing, but I'm going to still get that cookie. You know what I mean? They do that even as babies. Babies will do things, and you're like, whoa, this is that nature of sin, like the nature of that evil doing, like happens. You're like, okay, like these worlds are colliding. So there is emotional representation. That's why they scream or cry, and that's why people are like, let the baby cry, because it's telling us something, because they can't use words. And some of us, even as adults, we have physical reactions because we don't know what words to put to it. That's why we lash out. That's why we get physical at the steering wheel. Oh! We don't know what to do with it. And because we don't know the words to put to that emotion, going back to this idea, because we've not been taught, what is that emotion? And we've not been taught the discovery, because it's scary to go into those dark places. It is. Because you discover yourself more, and that's difficult. Next question. I saw a hand go up here. Good to see you, by the way.
Anna here. Thank you so much for coming to St. John's, David, and for doing your work across the state. You were asking, I think in the beginning you said how there are like so many instances in the Bible, including the New Testament, the Christian Testament, that could be used as teaching material, stories for mental health. And so I tried to think of, what's one that I can think of. And I thought of when Jesus asks Peter, do you love me, Peter? I think it's in John 21, the app tells me. And then he says, I love you, Lord, I love you. And he's like, feed my sheep. And then Jesus asks the third time if Peter loves him. And then it says, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. And I don't know exactly my question.
Yeah.
But that seems to be an example of like maybe anxiety or being insecure or wanting to feel validated in terms of love and belonging. And there are two people involved. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what friends or partners can do. You've talked about the importance of having a small conversation at a time. Maybe talk a little bit about that, like over long term, and what do we do once emotion is identified? Yeah,
very good. I'll address it this way. Whenever something happens to us, we go through typical three lenses. What is it saying about me? What are they saying about me? What do I think about others? And then what do I think about existential being, God? What does it say God thinks I am? Who does it think others say I am? And who do I say I am? Peter, in this instance, Jesus tells him, no, feed my sheep. And he does it 3 times. And Peter's like, you don't think I heard you the first time? He's like, no, you didn't, Peter, because you're the rock. Like, okay? And like, you didn't hear the first time. So I'm going to tell you one more time. And I'm going to tell you a third time. And then Peter translates. It's not what Jesus says. Peter translates. Do you trust me? Do you think I'm not going to do it? Is that what you told me the third time? Are you worried that I'm not going to feed your sheep? Peter translated that into hurt, potentially. Does that make sense? So what we hear from people, we take through the lens and they're like, does it mean that you're saying this? And you all have done this. Those of you with partners, those of you with spouses, you've done this. Your spouse has said something and then you implied what they said. Nobody's done that here? Okay, good. So that's a different conference. All right, that's a different conference. All right. So what I want you to understand is, yes, we'll see those things happen. Jesus was overcome with emotion when he found out Lazarus had died. Jesus was overcome with emotion in the garden. And this is like a teaser for next week. You don't want to miss next week. Jesus is overcome with emotion in the garden because he's about to go to the cross. And he says he wept in the garden with his assignment. But this is what I want you to think about, is that Jesus also knows, and we're going to talk about him next week, that Judas ends up dying by suicide. And I wonder, if Jesus was in that garden, in my theological imagination, I wonder if some of the weeping that Jesus was having in that garden is because he knows what it's like to lose a friend to suicide. He emoted because of his stress. In John and Peter, we translate these things. Did you say that I was this? Nope. I didn't say any of that. I just told you feed my sheep. I wanted you to hear it 3 times because you need 3 times. And you're going to actually deny me 3 times. So there's representation for that. So yes, you're going to see a lot of those types of situations in there along the way. And another question, any other questions, I should say? Ooh, back in the back there. Yep, all the way, yep. All the way in the back.
Hey, thanks, David, so much.
Yeah.
I don't have a precise question, but I think you're going to. I know you're going to follow it. So, I love how you're talking about emotions. I think this is an enormous part of the Gospels, but we got to read between the lines a little bit. So I just love what you're doing with that. Say a little bit, like, I'd love to see you just kind of keep talking about that. Like Episcopalians, one of the things I worry about us, and I became an Episcopalian in college, and I fancied myself an intellectual. I don't anymore. But the emphasis in the Episcopal Church on Scripture, tradition, reason, which I love. I mean, I just love it. And then our sober liturgy, which I also love. But I think sometimes it dupes us into being unemotional. And I'd love to hear you talk about kind of the dangers of that and then what we're really striving for. This is a liturgy and tradition that actually is trying to get us to put our hearts into this, to bring our joys and the sorrows to the table. It's all in the prayers. It's all in the gospel stories. We just miss it, don't you think, sometimes?
Oh,
but
yeah.
I'd love to see just like how the Episcopal Church, like, I do think our shadow side sometimes is that we're too cerebral.
Yeah. I appreciate this question, and I actually like it for a couple reasons. Number one is that military first responders have actually been conditioned to not have emotional response. So I have two brothers. One's a firefighter. One's a commander of police. And they've been actually conditioned to not show response, to actually shut this emotion down. And it actually debilitates relational dynamics. Relational dynamics with their partners, relational dynamics with their children, and relational dynamics with the community, to show empathy. Empathy is a quality that we were given divinely within our makeup of who we are. And when we take that and just push it all aside and say, no, let's just go all cerebral, which, just so we're clear, do you realize that the heart shares more information with the mind than the mind with the heart? Okay, and if you look at this word in the New Testament, it comes from the Greek word cardia, which we get our word cardiovascular. And the word cardia actually means the seat of our thoughts and our emotions. So we can have reason, but your reason's always going to be shaped and biased to your thoughts and your emotions. So we must be willing to address those things, because if we devoid the emotions, our reason might become super, super biased, or actually, in some cases, unhealthy. Now, this goes back to people like, then why is it that we have some of these phrases like, follow your heart? That might not be healthy. Okay, people are like, follow your emotions. No, please don't follow the emotions. Okay? Let your emotions tell you what's going on, because this is why we get people caught up into this mastery or this like, it's love. Love's this big emotion. And you're like, no, that's a bad relationship. Okay? That's unhealthy. You shouldn't be in that. The emotion should tell you something, and then you go discover what that emotion's telling you. From that process, if we are just solely reason, then we miss out on the other aspect of who we were created to be, to have this empathetic side. I think this is why Jesus is so brilliant at this. He would give reason with emotion. I think it's partnered with both. I don't think neither should be void of another, because if it's void of one of those things, it's not holistic. Reason is necessary, logical stuff, but also emotion's necessary, because that's how the neurochemical. You do not connect with somebody based on reason. You know that, right? You don't just connect with them because, like, we both won the same argument. You can be inspired by their intellectualism. You can be inspired by what they know, but guess what that's indicating? An emotion. This makes me so elated. I'm so happy when they share this stuff. And you can be invigorated. Some of us are invigorated by this, like, academic talk. But that's an emotional response. It's not a reason's response. Reason would say, it doesn't matter how much you know and how much I know. We are still just human beings. And then we robotically go through this. But if we're going to walk this aspect of faith out, we must do it with people. And when we have people in the room, emotions will always be involved. You'll feel it. That's why, and even I'll talk animals. Animals do the same thing. There are animals, like we had a dog that would know exactly when you were sad, come sit his head right in your lap and sit there with you because he knew the emotion. And neurochemicals are only transmitted by being with people. And reason doesn't just translate. When you sit next to somebody, your intellectual doesn't just go to them. But your neurochemicals do. The emotion does. What students call the vibe is there. Okay? Does that help answer your question? Yeah, very good. Any other questions as we wrap up our time today? I don't want to make you late for service because we got reason. All right, we got to be on time. Okay. All right. I've been taught to count to 7, and I counted to 7. So if there are questions that you have, I'm going to stick around here for a little while, and I'll be a part of our next service here as well. Thank you all for your time. I hope to see you next week. You all are amazing people. Be well.
David.
Put in a plug for service.
And for those joining us online, Holy Eucharist begins at 10:30 a.m. at the same place, sjcathedral.org. And do remember, if you've got you have children or grandchildren, there is the noon to 2 p.m. gathering for them with David. And if you've got any questions about that, you can see me or David shortly. Thanks again, and God bless you.